You can water a container every day and still end up with disappointing roots. And sometimes, watering more often is hiding the real problem. Think about a hot summer afternoon. You watered before breakfast. By 2 or 3 o'clock, the surface of the pot looks pale and dry again. A few leaves begin to droop. The container wall feels hot, so you reach for the hose and give the plant another quick drink. The next morning, you do the same thing. Then you repeat it for days, maybe weeks, because everything on the surface keeps telling you the pot is thirsty. But root crops are different from plants we grow mainly for leaves or fruit. Much of the result is hidden. A vine can look vigorous, while storage roots below the soil stay small. A tall plant can look impressive while the container is crowded underneath. And a crop that loves hot weather can still struggle if the root zone keeps swinging from wet to bone dry. So the real question is not simply, how often should I water? The better question is, what crop is in this pot? What is happening deeper in the root zone? And what kind of heat has this container faced today? That distinction matters because drought-tolerant does not mean no water. It does not mean drought-proof. And it definitely does not mean every crop on this list should be treated the same way. Some can handle short dry spells better than many thirsty summer vegetables. Some love heat but still need useful moisture around their roots. And a few are here because they teach us something important about timing, container depth, and the difference between keeping a plant alive and helping it build a harvest. By the end, you will have 12 underground crops to think about, but more importantly, you will have a simple way to decide what to do before you water again. And one of the crops coming later will actually suffer if you treat it the same way as a sweet potato. Before we start with the first plant, let's fix one misunderstanding. In the ground, a mature root system may explore a much larger volume of soil. In a container, every root is trapped inside a limited space. The sides of the pot can heat up in direct sun. Wind can pull moisture from foliage. A small container can move from comfortably moist to stressed much faster than a large one. That is why a plant described as drought-tolerant in a field or garden bed can behave very differently in a black pot sitting against a west-facing wall. And this is why the surface of the pot should not make the entire watering decision for you. The top inch can dry first. Mulch can look dry, while the mix underneath still holds moisture. On the other hand, a pot can also look damp on top because of a quick splash, while the deeper root zone remains too dry. So, the goal is not to chase appearances. The goal is to understand the crop and wet the part of the container where active roots are actually working. There is another detail that matters before the first crop. Establishment changes everything. A mature plant with a developed root system has access to more of the container than a fresh cutting, slip, division, or seedling. So even with a crop known for handling dry spells, the first part of the season usually deserves closer attention. I do not ask a young plant to prove its toughness. I help it establish first. Later, once roots have spread and the plant is actively growing, I can allow a more natural wet and dry rhythm. That single distinction prevents a lot of confusion, because gardeners often hear that a crop is drought tolerant and apply that label on day one. Let's start with sweet potatoes, because they show exactly why this conversation matters. Sweet potatoes are one of the first crops I think about when summer heat arrives. They love warm growing conditions. Their vines can spread quickly, and once established, they can tolerate short periods of dryness better than many leafy vegetables that demand steady moisture every day. But this is also where gardeners sometimes take the word drought tolerant too far. A newly planted sweet potato slip is not a mature vine with a developed root system. At the beginning, the plant is trying to establish new roots and connect itself to the container. If the potting mix dries hard during that stage, the plant can stall before it ever builds the growth you want. So early on, consistent moisture matters. Not soggy soil, not standing water, but enough moisture that the new roots can expand into the mix without repeatedly shutting down. Once the vines are established, the strategy changes. Now I want a container with enough volume to buffer heat, a loose mix that drains but does not turn dusty a few hours after watering, and a surface protected with mulch. I water slowly enough that moisture moves through the root zone. Then I allow the container to use some of that water before I water again. The mistake is giving the pot tiny surface drinks over and over. Sweet potato vines may stay green, but the deeper part of the container never receives a complete soaking. Another mistake is pushing too much nitrogen. You can end up admiring an enormous curtain of vines while the storage roots below remain disappointing. With sweet potatoes, the leaves tell only part of the story. And that is the first lesson of this video. A crop can look successful above the soil while the harvest you care about is still struggling below it. A roomy container helps because storage roots need space to expand. The mix should stay loose enough that those roots are not fighting a hard, compacted mass. Mulch slows the surface from heating and drying as quickly. And when you water, think about reaching the active root zone, rather than simply changing the color of the top layer. Sweet potatoes are forgiving once they are established, but they are not invincible. The goal is not to prove how long the vines can survive without water. The goal is to create a cycle where the plant receives a deep watering, uses that moisture, and then receives water again before the root zone becomes severely stressed. One more thing I watch with sweet potatoes is the relationship between vine growth and the surface of the pot. As the vines spread, they can shade parts of the container and reduce direct sun on the mix. That can slow surface drying compared with a bare pot. But if the vines trail over a hot deck while the container itself sits in full afternoon sun, the root zone may still heat quickly. So I do not assume lush vines mean the pot is comfortable. I still check below the mulch. And if I have a choice, I avoid letting the container become a hard, dry brick and then flooding it. A steady cycle is easier on the plant and easier for me to manage. The point is not constant wetness. The point is avoiding repeated extremes that force the plant to keep stopping and recovering. Now, the next crop changes the problem completely, because water is not the first thing I would worry about. The shape and size of the container are. That crop is cassava. Cassava is a serious warm season plant. It handles heat well, it grows with a strong upright structure, and it produces storage roots below the soil. But in a container, the harvest has to develop inside the space you give it. A plant can tolerate heat and still disappoint you if the underground part has nowhere to expand. This is why I do not think of cassava as a crop for a shallow decorative pot. I want depth, but I also want useful width. A narrow container may support the top of the plant for a while, yet the root system can become crowded. A broad, deep container gives the developing storage roots more room and also gives the pot a larger moisture reserve. The potting mix must drain well. Cassava does not benefit from sitting in a heavy, airless, waterlogged container. But well-drained does not mean the mix should be made from materials that let every drop race out in seconds. In hot weather, an extremely fast-drying mix can turn cassava into a constant watering job. I would rather build a balanced mix, water deeply, and then watch the plant and root zone. If the surface is dry but the deeper mix is still comfortably moist, another quick splash may not be necessary. If the whole root zone is drying and the plant has faced intense heat and wind, that is different. The top growth can also fool you. Cassava can look confident in the heat, and that can encourage a gardener to ignore the pot until the leaves clearly signal stress. But by the time a large plant is visibly struggling, the root zone may already have gone through a severe dry period. So, I prefer to read the container before the plant reaches that point. I also pay attention to drainage holes. They must stay open. A deep container with blocked drainage can hold a hidden wet zone at the bottom, while the top looks dry. That is another reason surface appearance is unreliable. When I build the pot, I make sure excess water has a path out, and when I water, I watch how the container responds instead of assuming every deep pot drains perfectly. Cassava also gives us an important reminder about safety. The roots must be properly prepared and cooked before eating. Raw cassava should not be eaten. That warning is simple, but it matters. The bigger gardening lesson is that drought toughness cannot compensate for the wrong container. If the crop needs underground space, give it underground space. You cannot water your way out of a cramped root zone. And now we come to a crop where doing more can become the mistake. Jicama is a warm season vine with an edible tuber hidden below the soil. Above ground, you may see vigorous climbing growth. Below ground, the tuber is slowly building mass. Jicama can handle short, dry periods better than crops that demand constantly moist soil, and it is a plant that can suffer when gardeners react to every dry-looking surface with more water. Imagine a mulched container after a hot afternoon. The top looks dry. The mulch itself feels dry. That does not automatically mean the entire root zone is empty of moisture. If you pull the mulch aside and check a little deeper, you may find cool, slightly moist mix underneath. That is why I do not let the color of the surface make the entire watering decision. With jicama, I want a container large enough for the tuber to develop and a trellis or support for the vine. I also want to avoid keeping the root zone continuously saturated. Deep watering followed by a period where the plant uses that moisture makes more sense than endless tiny sips. Here is where many container gardeners get trapped. They are afraid of drought stress, so they water by the clock. Every morning, every pot gets the same amount. The tomato gets water. The basil gets water. The sweet potato gets water. The jicama gets water. The ginger gets water. Everything is treated as if it has the same roots and the same needs. But a container garden is not one plant. It is a collection of different root systems living in different amounts of soil, facing different exposures. The jicama on a shaded side of the patio may still be moist, while the sweet potato near a hot wall has used most of its water. A schedule cannot see that difference. You can. Jicama also reminds us that vigorous vine growth is not an invitation to keep feeding and watering aggressively. If the vine is healthy, the goal is still to support the underground tuber. I want steady growth, not a container that is constantly pushed with excess moisture. And because the vine climbs, the foliage may be exposed to heat and wind above the pot, while the tuber sits in a cooler zone below. That creates two different stories in one plant. The leaves may look tired in the afternoon, but the root zone may still hold moisture. This is exactly when checking deeper can save you from an unnecessary watering. The next crop is even tougher above ground, but below the soil it can become so aggressive that the container itself becomes part of the control strategy. Jerusalem artichoke, also called sunchoke, is a tall plant that produces edible tubers underground. It can tolerate drought better than many garden crops once established, and that toughness is part of the reason it can become difficult to manage in open ground. The plant wants to spread. In a container, that tendency becomes both a problem and an advantage. The container limits where the tubers can move, making harvest and control easier. But a container that is too small can become packed with stems, roots, and developing tubers. Again, survival is not the same as production. Sunchokes can grow tall, so stability matters. A lightweight pot filled with a tall crop can become a problem in wind. I want a sturdy container with enough mass to stay upright and enough space below the soil for tubers to form. The surface can be mulched, and watering should be deep enough to reach the root system. A tiny daily splash can create a strange situation. The top layer stays repeatedly damp, but the lower part of the pot moves through a much drier cycle. That is not what we want. Slow watering gives the mix time to absorb moisture. If water immediately runs down the inside wall and out the drainage holes because the pot has become extremely dry, I may water in 2 or 3 slow passes, giving the mix a little time between passes to rehydrate. This is not about flooding the pot. It is about helping the water move through the usable root zone. Sunchokes also remind us that a tough plant can be a space hog. The container is not only a place to grow it, the container is a management tool. There is a practical harvest advantage here too. When the season is finished, a container lets you work through a defined volume of soil. That makes it easier to find the tubers and easier to remove the small pieces that might otherwise regrow. For a plant with a reputation for spreading, that control has real value. But control only works if the container is strong enough. Tall stems catch wind. A thin, lightweight pot may tip, and a root-filled container can become difficult to water evenly. So I want a stable base, room around the crown, and a watering pattern that reaches more than the first few inches. The next crop looks completely different. Above the soil, it can look like ordinary grass. Below it, the plant produces many small edible tubers. Tiger nut, also called tufa, is one of the most interesting underground crops for containers because the harvest is small, hidden, and spread through the soil. The foliage is grass-like. If you did not know what was happening underneath, you might not expect much from the pot. That makes the harvest especially satisfying. When the season is right and the container is emptied, the loose mix reveals dozens of small tubers that were invisible from above. Tiger nuts enjoy warmth and can handle periods of dryness once established. But again, container culture changes the equation. A small pot sitting in direct summer sun can heat much faster than open ground. The root zone can dry quickly from every side. So, I still care about container size, mulch, and deep watering. I like a loose, workable mix because the tubers are easier to separate at harvest. Heavy soil that compacts into a hard block makes the job more difficult. At the same time, a mix made almost entirely of coarse material can dry too fast. Balance matters. Tiger nuts give us another useful lesson. Do not judge a root crop only by the drama of the foliage. A plant with ordinary-looking leaves may be quietly building a large underground population of tubers. That is why this entire video keeps bringing us back below the soil line. Because the tubers are small, moisture consistency also matters during the period when the plant is actively filling the container. I am not trying to keep the mix wet, but I do not want a shallow pot drying completely from edge to edge every afternoon. A wider container can be useful because it gives the plant room to spread and makes the harvest easier to sort later. This crop is also a good reminder that small tuber does not mean small root system. The foliage may look modest, yet the underground network can occupy a surprising amount of space. Give that network room, and the container becomes a much more productive environment. And the next crop pushes that hidden harvest idea even further. Yacon can become a large, impressive plant above ground. The leaves are broad, the plant can fill a lot of visual space, and the underground harvest remains completely hidden. The part you are waiting for develops beneath the surface, while the top of the plant may look strong and healthy. Yacon is useful in this story because it shows why container volume and water storage are connected. A large plant with a large root system can use a great deal of moisture simply because there is more living tissue pulling water from the pot. If you try to grow that plant in a container that is barely large enough for the roots, the root zone has very little reserve. Hot weather can push it from comfortable to stressed quickly. This is where people sometimes misunderstand the idea of a drought-tolerant crop. They focus only on the plant's ability to survive a dry period. But our goal is not a survival test. Our goal is an edible, underground harvest. If the plant spends the summer repeatedly shutting down from severe water stress, it may stay alive but still fail to build the result you want. For yacon, I want space, a moisture-retentive but well-drained mix, and a layer of mulch. I water deeply, then I observe. Large leaves can droop during the hottest part of the day, especially when heat and wind increase water loss. That does not always mean the entire root zone is dry. Check the soil. If the root zone is still moist, and the plant recovers as the day cools, another emergency splash may not be necessary. But if the pot is genuinely dry, deeper down, the plant has faced strong exposure, and the container is light, that is a different story. Yacon also shows why afternoon wilt should be interpreted carefully. Broad leaves can lose water quickly in heat. A plant may droop temporarily when the air is hot and dry, even though the root zone still contains moisture. If you automatically soak the pot every time a leaf droops, you can turn a temporary heat response into a permanently wet root zone. I prefer to check again later in the day. If the plant recovers as temperatures ease and the mix is still moist, that tells me something. If the plant remains stressed and the deeper soil is dry, that tells me something different. Observation is more useful than panic. So far, this list has made hot weather root crops sound fairly simple. Choose a tougher plant, give it enough space, water deeply, and protect the surface. Now, we need to slow down. because ginger and turmeric expose one of the biggest misunderstandings in hot weather gardening. Loving heat is not the same as loving dry soil. Ginger enjoys warm conditions. It grows from rhizomes, sends up lush shoots, and builds more rhizome mass below the surface. But I would never treat a ginger container the same way I treat an established sweet potato vine. With ginger, I want the root zone to stay usefully moist without becoming waterlogged. That means the mix needs air, drainage, and moisture holding ability at the same time. Those three qualities sound contradictory, but a good container mix can provide all three. If the pot stays saturated for long periods, the rhizomes can suffer. If the pot repeatedly dries hard, growth can stall. So ginger sits in the middle of a very important container gardening lesson. Smart water use is not the same as withholding water. This is why I keep mulch around ginger, but I do not bury the crown under a wet, airless mass. I want to slow surface evaporation and protect the root zone from extreme temperature swings. Then I check moisture below the surface before watering again. A simple finger check can be useful in a small or medium container. In a large pot, I may also pay attention to the weight of the container if it can be moved safely, or use a wooden skewer to get a sense of moisture deeper in the mix. The exact method matters less than the habit. Check the root zone instead of reacting only to the surface. Ginger also shows why reflected heat matters. A pot beside a pale wall can receive direct sun plus radiant heat from the wall. A dark container can become hotter than the air. A windy deck can increase water loss. Two ginger containers with the same potting mix may dry at completely different speeds because their exposure is different. With ginger, I also think about the stage of growth. A rhizome that has just been planted and is beginning to sprout does not use water at the same rate as a large clump with many leafy shoots. Early in the season, overwatering a quiet pot is easy because the plant has not built enough foliage to use moisture quickly. Later, during active growth, the same container may dry faster, so the watering rhythm should change with the plant. This is one reason fixed schedules fail. The crop itself changes through the season, even when the weather stays similar, and turmeric makes this distinction even clearer. Turmeric loves warmth. It produces bold foliage and colorful rhizomes below the soil. But warmth changes how quickly a container loses moisture. In a hot, exposed pot, the top layer can dry very quickly, while the plant still depends on steady moisture deeper down. So turmeric is not a plant I would describe as set it out in the sun and forget it. I want a large enough container, an airy but moisture-holding mix, mulch, and a watering rhythm based on actual conditions. Here is the reason ginger and turmeric still belong in this video. They teach us that drought strategy is not about forcing every plant to live on the smallest amount of water possible. It is about reducing wasted watering, protecting useful moisture, and matching the water cycle to the crop. For a sweet potato, that may mean allowing the root zone to use more of the available moisture before the next deep watering. For turmeric, it may mean protecting the mix, so it does not repeatedly dry too far. The smartest garden is not the one that gives every plant less water. It is the one that gives each plant the water it can actually use. The same seasonal change happens with turmeric. Early growth can be slow, especially while the rhizome is establishing. As the foliage expands, water use can increase. Then, toward the end of the season, growth may slow again. A gardener who never adjusts the watering pattern can easily give too much water at one stage and too little at another. This is not complicated once you stop looking for a single number. Watch the plant, check the root zone, and notice how quickly the pot is using moisture now, not how quickly it used moisture 6 weeks ago. Now the next two crops change the question again. This time, water is not the only challenge. Timing is. Let's talk about carrots in summer. Carrots are often included in discussions about root crops for containers because they can grow well in a deep, loose pot. But carrots do not become tropical plants simply because we select a more heat-tolerant variety. The hottest part of summer creates a special problem, especially during germination. Carrot seed is planted close to the surface. That thin upper layer of potting mix can dry quickly under intense sun. A seed that starts to germinate and then dries can fail before you ever see a seedling. So the watering strategy for a newly seeded carrot container can be completely different from the strategy for an established sweet potato. During germination, the upper layer needs much more consistent attention. In extreme heat, I would also think about timing the planting for late summer, using light afternoon protection, or shading the surface temporarily so the seed zone does not bake. Once the carrots are established and roots are moving deeper, you can shift away from babying the surface. Now deeper, steadier watering becomes more important. A deep container and loose mix matter because the root needs a clear path downward. Compacted soil, stones, or a dense layer can lead to forked or misshapen roots. Again, you cannot solve that with more water. The physical structure of the root zone matters, and this is why the phrase heat-tolerant variety has limits. Variety choice can help, but it cannot erase every problem caused by planting at the wrong time or allowing the seed zone to dry during germination. Beets expose the same timing problem, but they add another lesson. Inconsistent moisture can show up directly in the root you plan to eat. Beets can tolerate warmer conditions than some cool season roots, but they still perform best when they are not being pushed through the harshest conditions with wild, wet, dry swings. In a container, those swings can happen quickly. Imagine watering heavily until water pours from the drainage holes. Then, the pot sits in full afternoon sun for several days until it becomes extremely dry. Then it is flooded again. The plant may survive, but survival is not the same as steady root development. For beets, I want consistency. That does not mean the soil has to be wet all the time. It means I try to avoid extreme cycles. I check the root zone. I water deeply when the pot needs it. I use mulch to slow surface evaporation. And in the hottest climates, I pay attention to planting windows instead of insisting that every root crop perform in the hottest week of the year. This may be the most important distinction in the entire video. Keeping a plant alive is not the same as helping it build the harvest you want. A drought-tolerant plant may survive neglect. But if the goal is roots, tubers, or rhizomes, we care about production. We care about what is forming below the surface. Horseradish makes that lesson interesting because this plant has a reputation for being hard to stop once it becomes established. Horseradish is a vigorous perennial root crop. In open ground, pieces of root left behind can regrow. In a container, that vigor becomes easier to manage. A deep pot helps contain the root system, makes harvest more controlled, and keeps the plant from spreading through a bed. But the word vigorous can be misleading. A new horseradish planting still needs moisture while it establishes. Once the root system is developed, the plant can tolerate stress better, but a container is still a limited environment. For horseradish, depth matters. A shallow pot works against the natural shape of the root. I want a deep container with loose soil, enough organic matter to hold useful moisture, and good drainage. Mulch helps, especially when the pot sits in direct sun. Deep watering encourages the root zone to remain active below the surface. The container also makes harvesting easier, because you can work through the root zone without digging through a garden bed. Horseradish brings us back toward the tougher side of the list, but the final crop pulls every lesson together. Timing, root depth, surface moisture, and the danger of using one watering schedule for every pot. That crop is daikon radish. Daikon develops a long root, so depth and loose soil matter immediately. A shallow pot, or compacted mix, can limit the root before water even becomes the main issue. The container should give the root a clear path downward. But daikon is also where we need to be honest about summer heat. In many parts of the United States, the absolute hottest week of summer is not the ideal time to sow daikon. In hot climates, this may be a crop for the transition out of peak summer rather than the middle of the most brutal heat. And that does not weaken this video. It strengthens the lesson. Hot summer container gardening is not only about finding plants that can tolerate punishment. It is also about using timing to reduce stress. A late summer sowing can take advantage of a container that is still warm while avoiding the worst heat during root development. During germination, daikon seed needs moisture near the surface. Once the seedlings are established and the roots move downward, deeper watering becomes more important. Loose mix helps the root remain straight. Mulch can protect the surface after the seedlings are established. So, after 12 crops, here is the question that actually matters. How do you decide whether one of these containers needs water today? I use 3 questions. First, what crop is in this pot? That sounds obvious, but it changes everything. An established sweet potato is not ginger. Jicama is not a newly seeded carrot container. Turmeric is not daikon. Before you water, remember what the crop actually needs. Second, what is happening deeper in the root zone? Do not let the top layer make the entire decision. Move the mulch aside. Check the mix below the surface. Use your finger, a skewer, or another simple method that helps you judge moisture deeper in the pot. If the root zone is still moist, another quick splash may only keep the surface wet. If the mix is drying deeper down, then the plant may be ready for a thorough watering. And when I say thorough watering, I mean water slowly enough that the mix has time to absorb it. A container that has become very dry can sometimes shed water. The water runs down the side, exits the drainage hole, and makes you think the whole pot is wet. In reality, much of the center may still be dry. In that situation, I water in slow passes. I apply some water, pause, and let the mix absorb it. Then I return and water again. I am not trying to flood the pot. I am trying to rehydrate the root zone. This is also why I dislike tiny daily sips as a universal strategy. A small splash may make the surface look better without wetting the deeper part of the container. Deep-rooted crops need access to moisture deeper down. The third question is, what kind of exposure has this container faced today? A pot in morning sun is not the same as a pot against a west-facing wall. A black grow bag is not the same as a thick, light-colored container. A windy deck is not the same as a sheltered patio. Heat, sun, and wind change how quickly water leaves the plant and the container. That means 2 pots containing the same crop may still need different decisions. This is why I do not believe in one summer watering schedule for an entire container garden. Water every 3 days sounds simple. Water every morning sounds simple. But the weather does not follow our schedule, and neither do roots. Some days are cloudy. Some days are brutally hot. Some containers receive reflected heat. Some plants are small. Some have filled the pot with roots. Some have broad leaves pulling more water into the air. So before I water, I think about crop, root zone, and exposure. Know the crop. Check the root zone. Then think about the heat, sun, and wind the container has faced. That simple habit can prevent 2 opposite mistakes: overwatering a pot that is still moist and underwatering a pot that has genuinely dried deeper down. There is one more reason I like these 3 questions. They work when the weather changes suddenly. A week of mild temperatures can make a watering routine feel perfect. Then a heat wave arrives. The same pot that stayed moist for 2 days may dry much faster, or a windy afternoon may pull more water from the foliage than a still, hotter day. If you follow the calendar, you may be 1 step behind. If you look at crop, root zone, and exposure, you can adjust. Now, let's talk about mulch, because mulch connects all 3 questions. Mulch does not make a plant drought-proof. It does not replace watering. What it does is slow moisture loss from the surface and help moderate the temperature around the upper root zone. In a hot container garden, that can be valuable. I like a layer of organic mulch thick enough to cover the surface but not piled tightly against sensitive crowns or rhizomes. Materials can vary. The exact mulch is less important than the job it is doing, protecting the soil surface. A bare potting mix in full sun can heat quickly. The top layer dries. Wind moves across the surface. You water again. With mulch, the visible surface may look dry, while the soil underneath stays moist longer. That is a good thing, but it also means you have to check below the mulch. Do not assume the pot is dry because the mulch is dry. Deep watering and mulch work well together because one puts moisture into the root zone and the other helps slow how quickly some of that moisture leaves the surface. But even the best mulch cannot fix a container that is much too small. Container size is one of the quietest causes of summer watering problems. A small pot has less water reserve. It heats faster. A large root system can fill the available space, leaving less room for moist growing mix. The plant uses water, the sun heats the pot, wind moves across the leaves, and suddenly you are watering far more often than expected. Sometimes, the smartest drought strategy is not a new fertilizer or a special irrigation trick. It is simply moving the crop into a larger container. A larger container is not automatically better for every plant, but for vigorous root crops, more usable root zone volume can create a more stable environment. The mix does not swing from wet to dry as quickly. The roots have more room. The underground harvest has more space. And this brings us back to the entire point of growing root crops. The result is hidden. For weeks or months, you watch vines, leaves, and stems. You mulch the surface. You check moisture. You protect young seedlings. You water slowly. You make decisions without being able to see the harvest. Then one day, the soil opens. A sweet potato emerges from the mix. A ginger rhizome appears under the surface. Small tiger nuts begin to separate from the soil. A long daikon slides out of a deep pot. That moment is different from picking a tomato you have watched turn red for days. With root crops, much of the season's result has been hidden from you. The leaves tell part of the story. The container has been building the rest below the surface. And that is why I do not want you to finish this video thinking the goal is to water as little as possible. The goal is not to see how long a plant can survive without water. The goal is to choose a crop that fits your summer. Build a root zone that holds useful moisture without staying waterlogged, and put water where the plant can actually use it. Sweet potatoes can forgive things ginger may not. Jicama may not need the same rescue watering as a shallow carrot seed zone. Turmeric may love heat while still needing protected moisture. Daikon may perform better when timing helps it avoid the harshest part of summer. Every one of those differences matters. So, the next time you stand in front of a container with a dry-looking surface, pause before you reach for the hose. Ask what crop is in the pot. Ask what is happening deeper in the root zone. Ask what kind of exposure that container has faced. Crop, root zone, exposure. Those three questions are more useful than one fixed summer watering schedule. And if you are building a container garden around hot summers and limited space, subscribe and keep growing with me. There are always more ways to turn a few pots into real food.